My connections with Sunshine were that originally we came to Sunshine, my family, for work opportunities. My father had been retrenched from his job and we lived in the country at Mulwala. And so we came to Sunshine to live where my parents, both of them, got a job at ARC, Australian Reinforced Concrete, which is just down the road a bit from where they bought a house. I was beginning work, being transferred to the Albion Explosives Factory, and I worked in the laboratory there as a technical assistant. I've lived in Sunshine itself from 1960 until 2011, which is about 51 years, I think, by my reckoning. So I've lived and I've worked in Sunshine. Got married at the Presbyterian Church, which is part of the gardens, or the church arrived there first and then the gardens were made available to the people of Sunshine. So the gardens have always been there, and I have enjoyed many hours and still do.
When did you basically first see the Sunshine Gardens?
I do recall the big high fence being all around, and it was even in front of the church. It was cypress hedge, and it was about 8 feet high, I think, and it was dense, and every so often there would be a small gate and an opening and a small gate where people could go into the gardens, and at the same time the bridge over the railway line was there, and people who lived in Albion were able to walk over that bridge and cross over the railway line. Otherwise you had to go up to the station where there was gates, and someone had to open the gates each time a train came and shut them again, and there were pedestrian gates. And that sort of took you out of your way a bit, so it was a shortcut to Sunshine, to the shops, which... There weren't very many shops in those days. It was a bit like a country town, really. The hall was the original church, and it was a weatherboard building. It was quite large. There was no parking space there, and there was a tennis court behind the church and the hall. The hall had been extended at the back because it was the original church. There's a picture in the boardroom of the church, and it shows this weatherboard building completely alone. I know that the church had tennis courts and the Mackay Gardens had tennis courts, and they were side by side. And I'd say that he meant it to be a place of recreation where people came and played sport if they wanted to, and tennis and bowls were considered, mild enough, but the church people didn't. They just came to church. They didn't have morning tea after church. You just came to church and then you went home. So the church didn't use the gardens very much. They had an old toilet block that was at the back of the church that was removed some years ago, and that was about the only toilet around in the gardens, as I recall.
So was there a fence then that separated the back of the church from the rest of the gardens?
Yes, and it was, again, hedge, but this was planted a bit later on, about the 1960s. 1964, 65, the minister planted some of the Muhlenbeckia hedge, and this grew up. It's a very dense thing that they use now for topiary, and it grew up right up to the top of the tennis court fence, which was pretty high. It was about a 20-foot fence or something. And it was very dense. And one of the sad things about it was that rats used to nest in it. So there were lots of rats in the garden, and the church was always sort of kept itself to itself by its fences.
So this is the 1960s then?
Yeah, we didn't go into the gardens very much, but there were gardeners working full-time. There was at least 2 who worked full-time in the gardens at first, and then it got down to 1. I think when the council decided that gardening and gardeners working full-time were not going to be employed anymore, it was then that the gardens seemed to go downhill, because there was nobody there to police who was in the gardens and what they were doing. destruction of the glass house was really rather sad. I think it was taken away. But I think before that happened, someone got in and set a fire in it because they burned they burned down the curator's cottage. The rotunda wasn't there at that time because the manse was built around about where the rotunda had been. At the back of the bowling green, the manse was built. I can recall it being built because when we first came in 1960, the manse was in Ridley Street, and it was one of the wonderful old houses in Ridley Street, which I think was pulled down and became a two-storey unit or something like that.
So the manse was built in about 1962, is that right?
No, 1962, 63. Certainly it was there when I got married in 65 because my wedding photo, we had our photos taken north of the manse, and, the manse is the background. Not the gardens, but the manse is where the photographer chose for our photos to be taken. Oh, it would have been about the 70s or 80s because I do recall that the gardeners weren't there and the flowers disappeared. There were, before that there were beds of annuals and dahlias, and there was a bit of garden around the bowling green, and when they watered the bowling green, the garden got watered too. And so it was rather sad when that got removed, when they took the bowling green away. They were outside the fence of the bowling green, but when they watered the water straight onto the gardens, there were bulbs, there was belladonnas that have just disappeared in time, and crocosmias, which we rescued and put them in that same garden where the other plant went, and they have survived a bit. The hedge got taken down, and in fact the gardens were opened up. It was felt that the more open the gardens were, the better they were for the safety of the public, I think. After the hedge had been taken down, it was very open then, and anybody could go in and do what they liked, I think. It certainly was taken down about the time the manse was put in, I think, because in my wedding photos in 1965, the hedge is not there. It must have been earlier than that the hedge came down. The trees have been good up until the drought that happened 2004 through to 2012. And it was then that we lost trees out of the gardens, and before that we hadn't really noticed them. We knew that the oak trees were there, and you always saw them because they were so prominent. You didn't pay a lot of attention. There were a couple of cedars, and there's one still in the manse garden, and there were a couple of others along there too that were removed. And the Judas trees went quite recently in the last three years or so. I think watering kind of stopped.
Okay.
Once the gardeners went, because I can recall Mr. McCall used to put the sprinklers on. Mr. McCall was one of the gardeners. He was about the last gardener in the gardens. It was about the time when I was working at the clinic, so it would have been between 1986 and 1993. He'd have them down where that oak tree is beside the church, not over in the manse, but he was there, and I can recall the minister's wife, if she saw things untoward happening in the gardens, she'd go to him and ask him to clear these people out of the gardens. I remember there were lots of belladonna lilies. I can remember at one stage a garden full of irises, but they were old-fashioned irises that irisarians would deign to grow at the moment, I think because there's so many lovely modern ones. They were up the north end towards the gates. I recall there was a lovely bed of aquilegias that was growing sort of near the tennis court area, and I can recall there being a dorianthus, or what are they called? Those giant lilies. And there was a tree called the Queensland firewheel tree. That was at the back of the manse, and that got pulled out. I can remember there was a whole bed of chlorophytums at the back of the manse too. They were growing it where there are seats and plumbagos and dieties and things over near the manse. They were there, and they all got removed. I don't know why, but maybe because they're a fairly ordinary, very easy plant to grow. I put some over near the walk in the gardens, and they're planting there. and I've kept them going. So there still are chlorophytums in the garden, but not where they originally were. They had been there for a while, but these were around about the 90s. They were prominent from about 1988 through to the 90s. I think they were removed about 1994.